everybody, my name is Jess and I'm the founder of Sallie Tomato. I'm here at Missouri Star Quilt Company to make the last project in our travel series. So I hope you've enjoyed the series so far, and by the end of today you'll have a complete travel set to even come and visit Hamilton. So for today's project, we are going to be making a travel bag that has an organizer on the inside, compartments, a mesh pocket so you can organize toiletries, cosmetics, art supplies, or even use it as a small lunchbox. So I think you'll find lots of uses for the Bette bag, and I'm going to show you step by step how to make all of these fun features part of this bag. So we're going to get started. You'll want to refer to your pattern for all of the cutting instructions. So cut out all the pieces. All the pieces are rotary cut. And you'll also want to fuse your interfacing to the wrong side of the fabrics. And first we're going to get started with attaching the foam stabilizer to piece A, which will be the outer panel of the bag, piece B for the top flap, and another piece for the base, and also one of your lining pieces F, and this will be for the organizer. So I've already prepped a couple of these, and I'll show you how to attach the foam with the outer panel. So what I love about using foam stabilizer is it's really lightweight and it just pops right back into shape, and it has that great body and stability to give your bag structure. So just place your foam on your work table and align all the edges of the outer panel with the foam so the wrong side is against the foam. And you can apply some basting spray to your fabric to help hold it to the foam. But I'm just going to use some sewing clips. And just like the other tutorials, the clips are great for holding together these thicker layers. So now that it's clipped together, I'm going to baste the fabric to the foam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And for a basting stitch, you can lengthen your stitch length to 5 or 6 millimeters long, since we're just tacking the pieces together. So we'll repeat for your top and your base and also that remaining lining piece, and then we're going to move on to create the handle. So starting with the handle piece, we're going to take this over to the iron and fold it in half lengthwise and just press it down the center. And open up the handle and press each of the long edges to the center. So you can use that center fold as your guide. And then fold it in half once more, and that will encase the raw edges. So then you'll want to top stitch an 1/8 inch from each of the long edges. So here's what the strap looks like top stitched. I already went ahead and top stitched mine. So then we're going to center this handle piece on the flap, and you'll want to line up the short raw edges along the short sides. And you'll notice that the handle will lift up in the middle. And then we're going to sew each end of the handle down and you'll want to sew a box that's about 2 inches long and then just sew across the handle. So I'm going to reduce my stitch length to about 2.5 millimeters because we want to make sure that this handle is nice and secure. So one side is done, and if you'd like, you can also top stitch an X through the center of the rectangle for extra reinforcement, and then you'll repeat for the other side. So this turns out super cute. You can set the top flap aside for now, and we're going to work on assembling the organizer. So I've grabbed all the pieces that I need to create this organizer. So this organizer will feature a little mesh pocket on the bottom, and then also a divided piece of elastic, so if you want to put pens or markers in here, or otherwise makeup brushes, anything that you'd like. There's a lot of variety of things that you can do with this little organizer. And you'll also notice that I have all my pieces labeled. There are quite a few little pieces to create this, but it comes together quite quickly. So we're going to start with our piece of elastic and the mesh to create the pocket. So I'll remove my little labels here. And the elastic is a double fold elastic that I'm using. And you'll notice that there's a center line and a shiny side and a matte side. You can have either side out. I usually do the shiny side out. It tends to fold a little bit better with the matte sides together, but it's up to you. It works both ways. And then you'll place your mesh along the center of the piece of elastic. And you can use some double-sided basting tape to hold these pieces together. So I'm just going to cut a little piece of tape and have it run along one half of the elastic. And take a pin to score the paper side. And then when you bend it, you can just pull off the paper. You definitely want to have a lot of tapes and glues on hand when you're making bags. So now you'll align the mesh along the center line of the elastic and just press it down to adhere it to the tape, and then fold the elastic in half. And I'm going to use some clips to hold the elastic in place. And then I'm going to top stitch 3/8 inch from that folded edge. So then you'll place your pocket right side up over the bottom edge of your divider piece. And you'll want to attach it to the piece that has the foam attached. So I'm just going to clip the side edges in place. And then top stitch 1/8 inch from the sides and the bottom. Make sure to leave that top open. So next we'll attach the elastic. So I've already went ahead and marked my lining piece F according to the pattern. So you'll measure down and mark a horizontal line, and then you'll mark little tiny marks at each of the indicated measurements in the pattern. And then you'll also want to mark your elastic piece. So once you have both pieces marked, you're going to align the short raw edges of the mesh along the sides of the divider, and you'll want the elastic, the top edge of the elastic, to be just below that marked line. I'm just going to clip those raw edges in place. And I use an iron away pen to mark each of these lines, so after I'm done sewing, I can just touch it with the iron and it'll disappear. So you want to use either chalk or water soluble, something that will not be permanent, to mark all of these lines. So I'm just going to leave this elastic loose and align each of the marks as I sew. So I'm just going to start with this first one, make sure to back stitch for reinforcement, and I'm going to sew across that first aligned mark. And you also want to sew an 1/8 inch from the raw edge, so I'll do that real quick. And then for the next line, you'll just simply take the elastic and align it with the mark on your lining fabric and sew, and you'll just keep aligning the marks all the way across. And I'm using contrasting thread so you can see my stitches, but you probably want to use something that blends in with your elastic, just for a little bit more professional look. If you like the contrast, you could certainly do that too. So I'm going to trim all these threads. There's quite a few here. So then you'll take the divider extension. So this little tab will end up getting attached to the side, and we'll attach it to the inside of the bag. So we can either move it out of the way or have it down for easy access. So we're going to take off the label here and place each of the divider pieces right sides together. And then I'm going to sew with 3/8 inch seam allowance along each of the short edges. Then you just flip it so the right side is out. And I'm going to give this a press over at the iron. And then top stitch a 1/4 inch from each seam. So now we'll attach the divider extension. So center it on the left-hand side of the organizer piece and align that long raw edge. You want to make sure that your elastic stays out of the way underneath. So I'm going to add a clip by the elastic. And then I'm going to just baste this in place 1/8 inch from the raw edge. So next we're going to round each of the corners of both of our divider pieces. So I'm going to grab my pattern and cut out the 2-inch circle template to round the corners. So here's my template, and I'm just going to position it in each of the corners and trace the outer edge. You'll want the outer edges of the template to be aligned in the corner. And I'm just using a permanent pen. You can use something that's temporary, but this will end up getting sewn in the seam. And then take your scissors and just cut along each of the marked lines. So after the corners are cut, you're going to take your divider pieces and place them right sides together and align all the edges and clip the layers together. So you'll want to leave about 3 inches unsewn along the left-hand side that has the extension attached. So I'm just going to mark so I remember where to start and stop, and this unsewn area will be for turning the divider right side out. So now I'm going to sew the pieces together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting and stopping at those marks that I made. And make sure to back stitch. And just keep the fabric aligned with that 1/4 inch line on the needle plate. So if you feel like you need to, you can always lift up the presser foot, do a stitch or two, and then keep pivoting around. But as long as that fabric edge is aligned across from the needle with the mark on the needle plate, then you will be maintaining that even seam allowance around the curve. So after you're done sewing, take your scissors and cut little snips around the curves. And this will help relax the fabric for when we turn it right side out and help distribute some of the bulk. So then we can turn it right side out through that turning opening. So just use your thumbs to push the fabric through. And if you have a stiletto or a turning tool, this Sallie Tomato Essential tool has a nice curved edge with a point to help smooth out the corners. So I'm just going to run that curved edge along the seam, and that'll help push the corner out. And you can use your fingers to help roll the seam edges as well. And I'm going to press this entire piece over at the iron. And I'm going to press on the side without any of the mesh or elastic. Just along the outer edges to have it lay flat. And then you'll want to turn the raw edges of the opening to the wrong side about 1/4 of an inch, because that was our seam allowance. Press that flat. And we can add some pins to hold the fold in place. And I usually top stitch from the right side. You'll just have to be conscious of your pins on the other side. Otherwise, you'll want to top stitch from this side to make sure that you catch that folded edge. And we're going to top stitch an 1/8 inch all the way around. Just be careful that you don't sew over the elastic. Make sure it's folded away from the side edge as you sew around with that 1/8 inch seam allowance. So here is the piece all top stitched. And if you didn't catch this here, you could always go back with a hand sewing needle or a little bit narrower of a stitch just to make sure that you caught that closed. So you can set this piece aside, and we're going to work on preparing the inner panel. So on the inner panel of the bag, there is a piece of elastic that I designed to hold small bottles. So you could put essential oils or nail polish in there. So first we're going to mark the placement for that elastic piece. So you'll want to fold your entire inner panel in half to mark the center, and you can either mark it with your chalk or just press it lightly with your iron. Then you'll measure up from the bottom, draw a horizontal line similar as before, and then also mark those increments for spacing the elastic dividers. I've already marked my elastic, so again I just marked those increments, just marking all the way across the elastic, and this time on each end you're going to fold the raw end about 1/4 inch to the wrong side, so that way the raw edge lines up with that first marking. And then I top stitched across, so that way the raw edge was concealed on both ends. So then you'll position the elastic so that way that folded edge is in line with the first marking. And you'll want the elastic below the horizontal line, so it will be closer to the bottom edge. There'll be more space above. I'm just going to pin it in place. And the same for the other side. And I'll repeat the same process as before, stitching the raw end of the elastic in place first at that first marking, and then I'll keep aligning the marks and stitching across the elastic. Next, we're going to attach the hook and loop tape, and this will be to hold the dividers, so that way you can insert them if you want to have the multiple compartments, or if you rather have an open area inside your Bette bag, then you can remove them easily with the hook and loop tape. So I've already separated my hook and loop tapes to have the hook sides together and the loop sides together. So we're going to start with 4 of the loop pieces. And we can set the rest aside for now. On each end of the inner panel, you'll measure in from the short end and mark 2 vertical lines for the placement of the loop tape, and then you'll also measure in from the opposite side. So you're going to take 2 pieces for each side and center it just to the inside of each of the vertical lines. And you can add a pin to hold it in place or use some double-sided tape along the center. So I'm going to tape it. That way it lays flat. The pin would have it pucker a little bit, so I like using the tape. Just make sure that you keep the tape away from the side edges and the ends where we're going to be stitching. So you'll want to make sure that it's centered top and from the top and bottom, and then you'll repeat to add another piece. So then you'll add the other 2 pieces of loop tape, remembering that you'll want them closest to the center of the inner panel. Once you have them taped in place or pinned, then you're going to top stitch an 1/8 inch from each edge, and I already have one done. So after top stitching, you'll fold the entire piece in half and then sew the short raw ends together with 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then trim your seam allowance to 1/4 inch wide to reduce some of the bulk. So here's what it'll look like all done. You have your loop tape attached and your elastic on the inside. What I like to do at this point is to mark which edge is the top, since you do want to make sure that the bottom edge is a little bit narrower of a distance from your elastic. The top edge will be a little wider. So take your top edge and mark on the wrong side. I usually just put the word top, and that's super easy for me to remember later on. So you can set this piece aside and we'll work on assembling the dividers. You'll have 3 pieces for your dividers. You'll have a center divider and 2 side dividers. So I positioned them on the table so that way the height of 10 inches is all going the same direction. And you'll want to press each of the 10-inch edges a 1/2 inch to the wrong side. So I've already went ahead and pressed each of those. Then you're going to fold each piece in half with right sides together. So you'll match the top and the bottom edge. And I like to add a pin at the folded edges to make sure that they don't shift while sewing. And the same for the side dividers. So then we're going to sew the raw edges together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Alright, so then we're going to turn these right side out. And you'll just roll the seam so it's nice and flat, and then we can press it at the iron. And we'll repeat for the other two dividers. So here they are all pressed, and then we're going to grab the foam to stabilize the dividers. So then we're going to slide each of the foam pieces into the dividers for stability, and for the side dividers you'll want the piece to be higher than it is wide. So make sure that you have the height positioned correctly so it'll be a tighter fit along the top and the bottom. And then you'll have the piece of foam centered, so just use your fingers to kind of gauge if it's centered. And there will be fabric on the ends without foam, and that's intentional for later on. And then repeat for the other pieces. I'm just going to reach in from the other side and pull that through. Be a little easier. And you can add some clips to make sure that the foam doesn't shift on the inside. And then we're going to top stitch an 1/8 inch from all 4 sides of each piece. So I already went ahead and top stitched each of the pieces and added on the remaining hook and loop tape. So I'm going to walk you through how I added that. So on the center divider, you'll want to add the remaining 2 pieces of the loops, and you'll measure in from each of the short ends, mark a line, and place them inside of the line towards the center and top stitch just like before. Then you'll flip the center divider over, and also you'll have one side of each of the side dividers, and you're going to grab each of the hook pieces of the tape and have them centered on each end with the outer edges aligned on each piece. And then you'll just top stitch them in place. So once that's complete, we'll move on to the top mesh pocket. To create the top mesh pocket, there are 3 things that you'll need. You'll need both of your mesh pieces and then also a 10-inch zipper. So I'm using a nylon coil zipper, so it's okay to cut and sew over the coil, and it does have a metallic finish, so it looks like metal. These are so fun to use, and we're going to start by making sure our zipper is going the correct direction. So if you're right-handed, you'll want the zipper to open to the right, and if you're left-handed, you'll want it to open to the left. So position it however is comfortable for you, and then we're going to place the zipper right side up over the top mesh piece, the shorter piece. And this zipper is cut a little bit longer, so you can slide the pull to one end so it stays out of the way while sewing. And real quick, I'm going to take this over to the machine and just stitch along the very ends so that way the pull doesn't accidentally slide off while we're working on attaching the mesh. So I'm going to slide the zipper pull all the way to the end again and align the top raw edge of the zipper along the top raw edge of the mesh, and add a couple clips to hold the layers together. So I have these raw ends aligned. and then the zipper pull is away from where we're going to be sewing on the other end. So I'm going to sew the two pieces together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I'm just going to finger press the mesh away from the zipper, but make sure to keep the zipper tape flat so the seam will be towards the mesh. And then I'm going to top stitch an 1/8 inch from the raw edge of the zipper. So now we're going to repeat the same process to attach the opposite end of the zipper to the larger piece of mesh, but this time we're going to align the bottom edges because when we sew it and it flips, that'll end up being the top edge. So make sure the sides are even. And then we'll sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then fold the mesh away and top stitch an 1/8 inch from the zipper. After top stitching, I'm going to slide the zipper pull back inside the mesh area, and with right sides face up, take one of your lining pieces for the top flap and align all of the outer raw edges, and then just clip the layers together. I like to add a clip right on the zipper coil to make sure that that doesn't shift. And then sew the pieces together with an 1/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. So as we sew over the other end of the zipper, just make sure that the coils are together and just sew across. I like to back stitch. And then continue on. So then you can take your scissors and just trim that zipper tape even with the side edge. And you can set this piece aside. We are so close to assembling the bag. We're going to finish up by installing the top zipper and finishing up the flap, and then we will assemble the entire bag. So first we're going to round the corners of each of the flap pieces. So we have our exterior flap with the handle and then our lining with the mesh pocket. So grab the little template again, position it in each corner, trace the outer edge, and then we'll cut along each of the marked lines. So then you'll grab a 27-inch double slide zipper, and the double slide just means that there are two pulls that meet in the middle. So that way the travel case can open from the center outwards, and then you just close it with the pulls in the middle. So starting on one end of the zipper, take your zipper extension out of your main fabric and place the right side of the fabric against the right side of the zipper and align those short raw edges. And then you'll take your lining zipper extension and place the right side of the lining against the wrong side of the zipper and align those short edges. I'm going to grab a clip and just clip the fabrics together. Then we're going to sew the seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you can remove the clip and then fold each of the fabrics away from the zipper and top stitch a 1/4 inch from the seam. So we'll start with our main fabric and align the other short end with the right side of the zipper on the raw end, and the same with the lining piece. So you're going to flip this around and match up the right side of the lining with the wrong side of the zipper, and then sew across with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you can remove the clip and then flip the extension so it's right side out. Make sure that your zipper is all right side out, nothing is twisted, and then you'll top stitch a 1/4 inch from the seam. So now we're going to mark the center points on the zipper and each of the flap pieces. So for the zipper, just line up the seams and mark the front and the back center. And then also mark on the opposite end. For each of the flap pieces, we'll just fold it in half. And mark the centers. So starting with the exterior piece, we're going to match up the back center of the zipper extension and the back of our flap, and add a clip. So the main fabrics should be right sides together, and then we'll also match up the front center marks. So I always like to line up the straight edges first. I can add some clips. And to help relax your zipper a little bit more, and ease around the curves, I'm just going to cut small little 1/8 inch snips in the edge of the zipper. And then when you go to align it, you can see that it lays a little bit more flat. And I like to add a lot of clips on the corners to make sure that the raw edges stay even. So then we're going to baste the zipper in place all the way around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And if you do have a zipper foot for your machine, I definitely recommend using it. It'll help maintain your seam allowance around the curves. And I'm going to stop when I'm close to the zipper pulls and just slide them out of the way. I'm going to just slide the pulls back to the front center so they're not on a corner. So then take your lining mesh pocket and you'll want to make sure that the zipper is positioned furthest away from the extension, and you'll place your mesh pocket right sides together with your main fabric. So start by lining up those center points and clip the outer edges together, making sure that the zipper stays towards the inside. And at the corners, you want to make sure the zipper is pushed in, so flatten it the best you can. And before we stitch these pieces together, I'm going to mark the place for the turning opening. So you'll want the turning opening to be where the zipper extension is, and you'll want to leave about 5 inches. So now we're going to sew these pieces together with 3/8 inch seam allowance. And as you go, you'll want to feel for those zipper pulls to make sure that they're out of the way. And the same goes for the mesh zipper pocket as well. So before we turn this, I'm just going to trim off some of the bulk from the corners. So I'm going to cut off about 1/8 of an inch or about 1/4 of an inch. Just be careful that you don't cut too close to your stitches. and then we can turn the piece right side out. So I'm going to give this a good press over at the iron. And similar to before, we're going to turn those raw edges of the turning opening a 1/4 inch in, and that will seal up the raw edge of the opening when we top stitch. So you can add some pins in place there, and then top stitch an 1/8 inch all the way around from the seam to seal up that turning opening, and it'll flatten it and give it a nice professional look. So here's how the top flap looks all top stitched. And again, just double check that your turning opening was sealed closed, and we're ready to assemble the bag. So here are all the pieces. So we have our inner panel. We have the outer panel, our divider, our base pieces out of our main fabric and our lining, and then our assembled flap. So starting with the outer panel, I've already went ahead and folded this in half, aligning the short side edges, and I already sewed this with 3/8 inch seam allowance, so that can be set aside. You'll want to use the 2-inch circle template to round each of the base pieces and set that aside as well. And then we're going to mark the center of the base pieces. And you'll also want to keep in mind for the outer panel, the side seam will end up being in the back, so that'll be the back center. And if we fold this in half, then you can mark the front center. After that's marked, you'll match the front center with the back center and match the side centers on both the top and the bottom edge. So then you'll repeat for all of the center marks on the inner panel, but this time just keep in mind that the side seam will be the front center. So again, you'll do your folding and your marking on that piece. And then you'll repeat for the base pieces. So you'll just fold them in half and mark all the centers in both directions. So we're going to start with the outer panel and then our main fabric base. And match the back center with one of the centers on the base, whichever one will be the back. And I'm going to clip it so the seam allowance is open to help distribute some of the bulk. So then you'll do the same on the front and match up the front centers and the side centers. Then the straight edges, and lastly, ease in the corners. Okay, so now we're ready to sew the base in place. And we're going to use 3/8 inch seam allowance. I find it's easiest to have the base against the sewing machine, and you can start wherever you like. I recommend on a straight edge and not a corner. And at the corners, just make sure to squish the foam down out of the way and keep those raw edges even. So just double check that you caught all the edges of the seam, and then we'll repeat to attach the top flap. So align that zipper extension with the back seam, and the main fabrics should be facing each other. Remember to finger press that seam open. So then we'll sew this with 3/8 inch seam allowance, just like before. And this time it's going to be a little bit easier to access with the outer panel against the machine, just the way that the zipper lies. So whichever is comfortable for you and your machine. So here at the zipper, I'm just going to back stitch and cut the thread and slide it out of the way. And that'll be much easier to sew past. So I'm going to leave the exterior wrong side out, and now we'll repeat the same process for the lining. So we'll attach the base piece, and this time we're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So just remember that we're attaching the base, so you'll want the bottom edge to be lined up with the base piece. So now we're going to trim the lining seam allowance to about 1/4 inch wide. To get rid of some of that extra fabric, and the reason why we use a wider seam allowance was so that way the lining is just a little bit smaller than the exterior and it'll fit neatly inside. So then take your exterior and unzip the zipper, and then just let the flap sit down inside, and take your organizer and place the mesh sides together and center it over the zipper extension and add a couple clips. And then top stitch this in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So then you're going to take your lining and turn it right side out and match up that side seam with the front center. Clip that in place. Then we'll match up all of our centers and clip around the entire top edge. Alright, so then along the back edge, I'm going to mark that opening that we want to leave. So I'm going to leave about 6 inches. So mark that, and then we're going to sew around the top edge with 3/8 inch seam allowance. And make sure to backstitch, since we will be turning the bag through there. You want that beginning and ending to really be reinforced. Okay, so now we're ready to turn the bag right side out. So first I'm just going to pull the divider through, and then the flap, and then the rest of the bag. And then you can reach in and smooth out all the corners. And put the lining down inside the bag. And then the final step is to close up that turning opening and top stitch around the top edge. So I like to roll the seam and clip it so the zipper is nice and tight against the top edge. So work your way around the entire top edge. And I'm going to add some pins to hold this area in place. And you can top stitch either from the lining side or the exterior side. Either way, be conscious of your zipper pulls and the pins. Make sure that the flap and the divider stay out of the way. And I'm going to top stitch from the lining side just to make sure that I catch that opening to seal it closed. And we're going to sew with 1/8 inch seam allowance. So here is your bag complete, And I'm going to grab the dividers so we can add those inside. So start with the center divider, and you'll fold the ends with the loop tape facing the front, and you'll stick the sides together. And then you can take the side dividers and add those. And then you can see the little organizer just sits right on top. Our mesh pocket is easy to access and going the correct direction. And when we zip it up, then it really takes its shape. So you can press out any of the creases from turning, and your new travel bag is ready to use. I hope you enjoyed watching this and using your brand new bag, and learned lots of tips for different techniques and working with a variety of materials. For more inspiration and bag making tips, follow me at Sallie Tomato Patterns on Instagram and Facebook. And if you decide to make this project, we would love to see it. Share with hashtag Sallie Tomato and hashtag MSQC Show and Tell. Thanks so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.
Hi everybody, it's Jenny from the Missouri Star Quilt Company. We hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you aren't already part of the Missouri Star Quilt Company family, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss a thing. And if you click that bell, it'll notify you every time a new tutorial comes out. See you next Friday.